And welcome back to the Hardware News Recap for the week. We have a really good episode for you. So I sat down to write this episode, and there's a lot of news. There is no shortage of news for this past week, but one of the big topics that was a little strange to me was the YMTC ban. So previously, the US government banned YMTC, the Chinese flash NAND manufacturer that actually was making some real progress. The US banned them because Apple was considering using YMTC, and then in the past week, YMTC and CXMT were removed from the US entity list. And then the Pentagon said, actually, can you re-add them to the list? And now it's not clear if they're on the list or not. It is Schrodinger's entity list. YMTC is both banned and unbanned as long as Apple doesn't try to use them. That's what I took away from the developments there. In addition to that wild story, there's potential delays caused by the psychotic AI timeline we're in, and these include the Sony PlayStation 6 and potentially a price increase for the Nintendo Switch 2. Also, Valve says it's struggling to restock the Steam Deck due to shortages. In other news, Corsair has some pretty cool colorways for its Frame 4000D case. Also in the news, the tariffs have been at least partially struck down by the Supreme Court. We'll talk about that. And NVIDIA says it can write 3 times more code using the help of AI, presumably so that it can fuck up its drivers 3 times faster. Before that, this video is brought to you by Thermal Grizzly and their new Duronaut thermal paste. Thermal Grizzly claims its Duronaut paste is intended for long-term stability and endurance, focusing on paste longevity in addition to the usual performance focus. Thermal Grizzly's Duronaut paste comes with applicators and spreaders, and ships in numerous tube sizes, aiming to provide a high-end paste for PC builds and daily driven overclocks by enthusiasts. Learn more at the link in the description below. Right, up first, you've caught me in the middle of reviewing a Yeston waifu GPU. That'll be coming up. It was going to go up first, but now news is going up first because there's breaking news that we are putting at the beginning of this episode. I'm not going to do the bullshit thing where I make you wait till the end of the episode for the interesting news, which is that the tariffs have at least been partially struck down, at least the ones imposed under a specific act, the IEEPA. And this comes after a 170-page ruling and opinion, which I have now read a little over half of. This literally just happened, and it is very dense. And the key thing here is that it's a 6-3 ruling striking down the Trump administration's tariffs. If you haven't seen it, we have a full-feature documentary on the tariffs as they were imposed last year. It was complete chaos at the time. Really fascinating documentary series with transparency on the margin structure for some of these companies. So that's still relevant today and interesting. But if you want to check that out, we've got the full coverage of how it happened as it happened with the tariffs and how they impacted specifically the computer and the hardware and silicon industries. Now, though, we get to cover briefly the back half of that, and we're going to have a full separate piece on GNCA going into depth on also some of the weird connections with Howard Lutnick's family, the Commerce Secretary, who potentially stands to benefit, it looks like, from tariff refunds that companies may be filing for. So, all right, let's get into this. So, any tariffs which are imposed under other acts and laws would not be affected, but those imposed under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or the IEEPA, are the ones that were ruled to be illegal. These are under the Trump administration. They started last year. And last year, the Trump administration said it would investigate alternative acts and laws or methods to impose tariffs if these were struck down, which they now have been.
And what license has ever been issued without the right to charge a fee? You get a license, you charge a fee. It's automatic, but not with this court. But now the court has given me the unquestioned right to ban all sorts of things from coming into our country, to destroy foreign countries. But a much more powerful right than many people ever thought we even had, but not the right to charge a fee. How crazy is that?
3 of the current Supreme Court justices were appointed by Trump himself, including Coney Barrett, Kavanaugh, and Gorsuch, leading to last year's expectation that Trump's tariffs might stand. Of these, only Kavanaugh was in favor of Trump's application of the tariffs. The 3 who were in favor of Trump's tariffs include, again, Kavanaugh, appointed by Trump, Alito, appointed by Bush Jr., and Thomas, appointed by Bush Sr. The official government PDF, which is unrelated to the other official government PDF files, reads the following. Quote, "The question presented is whether the IEEPA authorizes the president to impose tariffs," end quote. It later says, quote, "Against that backdrop of clear and limited delegations, the government reads IEEPA to give the president power to unilaterally impose unbounded tariffs and change them at will. That view would represent a transformative expansion of the president's authority over tariff policy. It is also telling that in IEEPA's half-century of existence, no president has invoked the statute to impose any tariffs, let alone tariffs of this magnitude and scope, end quote. This is pretty interesting. Those of you who watched our tariffs documentary might find two pieces of this familiar. One is that it was specifically Louis Rossman's section in that where we were talking to him about his repair shop and the tariffs impacting his hot air stations that he imports. He talked about how it should all just be up to Congress and follow the intended pathways for tariffs to be applied. So he talked about that in there a little bit and nailed it. This is exactly what they're saying here in the Supreme Court ruling.
Would you like to buy one? Oh, you don't. You're the one who bitches every time I raise the price by $20. Well, fuck you.
And the other thing that's familiar here to what we've just read so far is all of the companies that were talking about how it was the chaos, uncertainty, or general, just literal day-to-day changes where they go to bed and it's a 35% tariff, they wake up, it's 170%, they go to bed one more time, it's like 65%, like some kind of terrible RNG built into a, I don't know, like the Elder Scrolls to see if the Dark Brotherhood's going to approach you. That is accidentally a much more fitting analogy than I intended it to be. And it was right there, right at the top. I'll roll with it. But anyway, the quote continues. Quote, that lack of historical precedent coupled with the breadth of authority that the president now claims suggests that the tariffs extend beyond the president's legitimate reach. The economic and political significance of the authority the president has asserted likewise provides a reason to hesitate before concluding that Congress meant to confer such authority. The stakes here dwarf those of other major questions cases, and as in those cases, a reasonable interpreter would not expect Congress to pawn such a big-time policy call off to another branch, end quote. The 170-page document also wrote, quote, had Congress intended to convey the distinct and extraordinary power to impose tariffs, it would have done so expressly, as it consistently has in other tariff statutes, end quote. In short, the court ruled against Trump. What's unclear to us is how the refunds are handled. But there's good news. We're not alone, because the Supreme Court also has no fucking idea how they're going to be handled. Kavanaugh wrote this, quote, in the meantime, however, the interim effects of the court's decision, he was in favor of the tariffs, could be substantial. The United States may be required to refund billions of dollars to importers who paid the IEEPA tariffs, even though some importers may have already passed on costs to consumers or others. I'm just going to interrupt right there to say that Kavanaugh, he has one point, which is that, yes, the cost has already been passed on to consumers in most cases, but it's totally non sequitur. But that's not how it does. It's irrelevant. That's like saying we're not going to retrieve the money that was stolen from you because they already spent it. Like that's not, it's still your money. So it's kind of a separate issue. It is an issue, and it's a big one. And it's one that we care a lot about, that we've already talked about for 5.5 hours between the two videos that we published on the topic of just how much consumers are getting fucked over by this, whether or not the tariffs stay, which now they are not. So we already talked about that, but this is a different thing. You don't just get to keep the money that you've illegally stolen because it would be inconvenient to give it back because somehow there was some other third-party exchange where maybe they took in more money to account for the stolen money that was stolen. So anyway, let's continue with his statement or whatever opinion. Quote, as was acknowledged at oral argument, the refund process is likely to be a mess. Oh no, not a mess. In my federal government, one issue will be refunds. Refunds of billions of dollars would have significant consequences for the U.S. Treasury. The court says nothing today about whether, and if so how, the government should go about returning the billions of dollars that it has collected from importers, end quote. Yes, in the same way that returning a printer to Best Buy would be a mess for them to process the return and repackage it and restock it, it's really not the concern of the people who are owed the money. Even if, yes, they have accounted for that money in many cases, but not all, because we didn't adjust most of our prices. The mod mats, for example, are still $100, just like they were in 2017, even though money has lost a lot of value since then. But the point being that it's a separate issue entirely, and trying to combine the two it's just a weaselly way. He's pretending like he's voting in favor of the tariffs as if it's a thing to benefit the consumers. That is not at all what this is. Like, it is just objectively worse to illegally and irrationally and unpredictably apply tariffs than it is to just refund the money that was taken under those applied tariffs. But unfortunately, this wasn't in time for some of the businesses we know in the industry, where a lot of them now, and we have a separate video coming up on this, have experienced significant layoffs, and a lot of them citing specifically the tariffs as impacting the bottom line enough to where they had to cut people from staff. So it doesn't come in time to help them, whether or not they get their money. It may help later, but this also comes again after the costs have been passed to consumers. The story is still changing right now, though, in a press conference hosted the same day as the ruling. So after we filmed even the insert that we filmed after the rest of the news, it's still developing. After rambling about how he saved Intel, Trump also said he would be issuing an executive order that implements a global 10% tariff under a different act later today, likely around the time we publish. This, though, was the wildest quote out of the whole presser. We'll expand on this more in a separate video, but here you go.
The same thing with, as an example, Taiwan. Taiwan came in, they stole our chip business. They make chips. For 30 years longer, they made chip, and they put our companies. Intel would be now the largest company. I saved Intel. I literally saved it at the beginning of this administration.
What may be interesting to be aware of is that Secretary of Commerce and Epstein Island visitor Howard Lutnick's family has connections to companies that intend to handle tariff refunds. And by connections, I mean runs them. We've been talking a lot about corporate corruption in collusion with the United States government lately, especially in the tech companies and the AI companies. This is another interesting one, in our opinions, where it seems like the plan here would be companies could theoretically sell some percent of the tariff refund they would be, let's say, owed, to a private company that buys that refund for pennies on the dollar and then pursues the potential refund itself. So effectively, the idea is this private entity would be buying your right to money so that you can get cash now for pennies on the dollar, what you're owed, and then they go then pursue the full amount later. So they profit on that exchange, obviously, by getting the full amount. If you're to effectively sign your rights to $100 over, and they give you $40 today, the idea is that the companies that go for this are desperate or they don't intend to pursue it on their own. They need a fast cash payout right now. They get a bailout for some percent of the tariff, and then the rights to the rest of that money goes to the private entity. So this is something we'll talk about this more in our full GNCA piece, which you can find over on our second channel. We have not filmed that yet. We are working on writing it right now. So we'll be putting that together. But anyway, that's kind of the tariff news. This is news as of hours ago when I'm filming this, and we're going to be posting hopefully the same day that we're filming. So as it develops, we'll continue covering it. But the in-depth piece will be GNCA for this one. So check that channel, subscribe to it for the follow-up. But let's move on to the rest of the news story. I'm going to clear the Yeston waifus off the table. Up first, the most recent set of companies to be affected by the DRAM and storage shortages that no doubt everyone is sick of hearing about by now is going to be console makers. So the current rumor is that Sony's PlayStation 6 is getting pushed back to potentially 2028 and 2029, and Nintendo Switch 2 is going to increase in price both as a result of the memory shortage that exists right now. And that news is coming from a report from, let me just get the source right, Bloomberg.
Uh-oh. Oh, no. Do you know what that means? Means.
4 elephants.
Bloomberg ran a recap of companies affected by the DRAM pricing surge. If you missed it, we recently ran a piece on GPU pricing trends, and within that, we included a look at GDDR6 spot price increases that have forced additional costs on top of already expensive GPUs. Now, the VRAM price increase just happens to be the most recent look at DRAM prices that we've done, where DRAM's used for GPU memory as well. But the consoles are contending with potential increases in CPUs and GPUs. They are contending with definite increases in DRAM supply cost, that is, and then also with cost increases for SSDs now. So the Bloomberg report mostly goes over things we've covered elsewhere, but there's one paragraph that stood out to us. The outlet claims that Sony is, quote, considering pushing back the debut of its next PlayStation console to 2028 or even 2029, end quote, and it's citing sources, quote, familiar with the company's thinking, end quote. Weird phrasing for that. It's unclear to us if they mean active thinking, like right now, or just general strategy. But the context makes it believable. It's just a weird way to phrase it. Bloomberg also states that Nintendo is considering, quote, raising the price of the Switch 2 in 2026, end quote. As far as we're aware, Sony hasn't publicly made any official roadmap statements for the PlayStation 6. So this is kind of in that same camp as the 50 Super Series refresh, where it's not an officially announced product, but there's talk of delays or cancellation, and you get the whole, if a product falls in a forest and no one is there to unlaunch it, then did it really launch to begin with? But in any case, this is all believable. Products in general right now, future products that is, appear to be stalling as companies wait to try and figure out what the fuck is going on with the memory supply and pricing situation, which makes sense. Valve talked about this recently, actually, with its Steam Frame and Steam Machine delays on pricing announcements as a result of that. So in similar news, following Valve's post about the Steam Machine and Steam Frame supply that we covered previously, the company followed up with another statement, this time about its Steam Deck OLED. This past week, Valve posted about availability on its Steam Deck store page. Quote, Steam Deck OLED may be out of stock intermittently in some regions due to memory and storage shortages. Steam Deck LCD 256GB is no longer in production, and once sold out will no longer be available, end quote. Valve was already winding down the 256GB LCD model, so that's not much of a surprise, but the first sentence is news. There's not much here other than the obvious, which is that Valve is either struggling to get access to memory and storage supply, or has decided it isn't willing to increase the prices for the, at least, deck in order to secure it. This also comes at a time where Valve might need that supply, depending on what their contracts are, if they exist, for the memory, in order to make its Steam Machine and Steam Frame devices. So depending on what it has available from the suppliers, they may be choosing to allocate it elsewhere if they even have it available. Now, because Valve is the only supplier for these devices, unlike video cards that have multiple board partners, they don't have a mechanism to hide a price increase behind multiple layers of retail, distribution, and partners. Whatever the price is, you know it's set by Valve. Now, if only for that reason, if Valve's current pricing for its supply would make it impossible for Valve to sell at the retail pricing it wants to hit, then maybe intermittent stock makes more sense to the company than actually permanently increasing the price or something for the deck. Valve has been very cost conscious of the hardware that it sells for a while now, and seems to want to maintain a certain reputation for the price of its devices. So maybe that's one of the reasons. But as a discussion topic, this is actually one of the things we expressed earlier in the shortages, and I remember talking about during the, I think it was the COVID shortages previously, but these situations will always benefit the largest companies the most. So companies like the smaller laptop manufacturers, the SIs that are smaller, the handheld manufacturers that are smaller, they're going to be the ones who are the most negatively affected by the supply and availability situation, the pricing of memory, because the huge companies, they can soak as much of that as they can, or they're maybe just in such demand or so monopolized that it doesn't matter. But the smaller companies might not be able to get away with price increases. They might not have the leverage. They probably don't have the leverage with the memory suppliers that the larger companies have. And so they're the ones who are going to be the most threatened as a business from the supply shortages and the cost increases. Also, a customer is probably less willing to take a chance with a manufacturer they've never heard of if the pricing is just equal with the competition that is incumbent, because they happen to have more favorable pricing for contracts for memory and flash and things like that. Now, Valve is not a small company, so big difference there. They're also not that small of a hardware manufacturer, but they absolutely are not a big hardware manufacturer like the ones we normally cover. So it does have less leverage. It's still a gigantic company. I think the big difference for Valve is that at most, this delays their rollout into the hardware market. It would affect their initial plan to capture some of the actual home computer market with the Steam Machine, but it's not going to kill them. I mean, Valve could stop selling hardware in an instant and still be basically the most profitable company to have ever existed, because it's a platform that sells software through download. So they're fine. But the point is, just as a discussion topic, I do think this situation, you see how it's affecting Valve, where they can't even figure out when the fuck to launch their Steam Machine and Steam Frame, and they're not sure what the pricing's going to be yet. And you have to wonder, how is this affecting all the other companies that we may not have even heard of that just can't stay in the market or enter the market because they're not able to compete. So anyway, up next, Corsair has launched 2 new colorways for its Frame 4000D series of cases. The Frame series cases we actually really liked when we reviewed them, the Frame 4000s especially, for their affordability and for their overall quality. Best cases that Corsair's launched in years, actually, after a number of failed cases. And the new ones are called the Nova for a deep blue and white color scheme, and the Galaxy for a dark red-ish sort of purple imbued mixed with a black gradient. Overall, we've been positive on the Frame series of Corsair cases. The recent price changes have cemented that, with the Frame 4000 DRS ARGB, which includes 3 front fans, regularly at $90 to $100 lately. The 2 new cases have a color shift paint job with a 2-tone look to it. The photo reel also shows that the limited plates for these cases max out at, unless it's a joke, 1337 units. But leet speak isn't something you joke about. It's also something I'm still fluent in from my days of playing on GameSpy, which was a platform I always hated using, but was forced to use, I think, as Westwood folded more services into it. But we can talk about that another time. We put it up there with the, maybe we'll do a Steve surprises locals with leet speak video next time in Shenzhen or something. The colors look good on these cases. The price is higher, predictably. They're $140 empty, making the empty special colored frame cases more expensive than a black frame case with 3 ARGB fans, but they do actually look pretty cool. We're happy to see Corsair is expanding on the case line that has been its most successful lately. There's one other change we saw. Corsair's new Colorways have 3 USB Type-C connections in the front I/O, with 1 20 gigabit per second port and 2 5 gigabit per second ports. Up next, we've been talking about SSD prices creeping up alongside DRAM for a while now, although at what was at least initially a slower pace. You can see this in PC Part Picker's average SSD price trend charts, where the average cost of a 2 terabyte SATA SSD is now around 3 times what it was in October. A 1 terabyte NVMe M.2 SSD is now about 2.3 times what it was in October, and a 4 terabyte NVMe SSD is also about double. The PC Part Picker trends also show hard drives climbing in some instances, like 3.5-inch 16 terabyte drives, going up by about $60 to $80 over the course of the past 2 years. In the news this past week, Western Digital's earnings call transcript featured a question from banking and investment firm Morgan Stanley to ask about contracts and purchase orders into the next 2 years. CEO Irving Tan responded, quote, "We're pretty much sold out for calendar 2026. We have firm POs with our top 7 customers, and we've also established long-term agreements with 2 of them for calendar 2027 and 1 of them for 2028. Obviously, these long-term agreements have a combination of volume of exabytes and price," unquote. Tan noted, maybe eerily, that hard drives are becoming disproportionately valuable for monetized AI inference use cases, and so they're charging more, quote, "in relation to pricing. I think first it's important to recognize that our customers actually have seen value, that there's actually a structural shift in the value that we deliver to them, especially in the impact that we have to their total cost of ownership as the business moves more and more towards inference where monetization is happening. So in this case, the pricing that we've provided there reflects the value that we're delivering to them," end quote. That shouldn't really surprise anyone at this point, but in this statement, he is straight up saying that they are able to increase the price because the value has increased. Hard drives have been an industry most heavily affected by, as you'd expect, SSDs over the years, where consumers are less and less often buying hard drives, although data center use has skyrocketed, so they're in a pretty good spot overall. But he is pretty much just straight up saying that they can increase the price because they're more valuable because of AI inference. However, he does later say that they, quote, "want to deliver predictable pricing to hyperscalers because one of the things that they're concerned about is the high volatility of some tiers of the storage space," end quote. In response to another question, the CEO recommitted the company to data centers, saying, quote, "We've really pivoted our organization to be centered around our big hyperscale customers with dedicated teams for each of them," end quote. In case there was any question as to where that demand comes from, WD said this, quote, "I think the initiative that NVIDIA has been driving is really to help accelerate inference capability. As a result of that, the velocity and the volume of data is going to get generated much more rapidly. And the benefit from us, obviously, it will require a lot more storage, which obviously hard drives are well suited with the superior economics," end quote. Now, unfortunately for, we go with humanity, storage takes storage, and a lot of it. So in addition to racks upon racks of GPUs and servers deployed in data centers that require physical real estate, they need to bulldoze and flatten whatever's there, sometimes including people's lives. They will also need space for tons of hard drives, especially for inference. And one of the things to think about too is every time, if you do use it, you use ChatGPT or Claude or Gemini or whatever. If you're a user of one of these tools, obviously it's saving everything you type in it, just like Google search would be if you're logged into your Google account. You might have history turned off. Do you really think they don't save what you're searching for though? And when using these services, every time you're having a conversation with GPT, uploading an image to it, to ask it to analyze whatever, all of that stuff is going to be saved in their data centers as they continue to train on it to, I assume, make the product worse every time they update it. That seems to be about what they're trying to do. And that's just going to require a lot of hard drives to store all the stuff you're saying on a regular basis with it, plus whatever else they might be using for training, like all of the stuff they steal. If you missed it on GNCA, our other channel, we just covered the NVIDIA lawsuit where NVIDIA is being sued now in multiple instances for what the plaintiffs say is theft of various types of intellectual property, including something like 39 million almost videos from YouTube. We also have a Meta video talking about the same thing, where Meta pirated books and openly said as much in its own internal dialogue, and then it's fair use. It's fair use for them. That's fine. They're huge. They're worth billions of dollars. They spend a lot of it on lobbying. All this requires physical space, though, and there's thousands of data center construction projects going on worldwide right now. So you likely have one going in somewhere near you. In addition to the hardware prices, this will undoubtedly affect a lot of people, millions of people in the physical space as well, whether that's because the data center is actually near them or just because it's affecting the energy costs, the cleanliness or reliability of the air or the water near them, or the real estate price near them, whether it's up or down, depending, I guess, on how close you are to the data center itself and if the data center wants to buy your land next. Anyway, up next, NVIDIA had a rough launch for its RTX 50 series. I mean, they printed money. They did well in that respect, but they also screwed up a lot of things, and one of them was the drivers, where the drivers were so bad at launch for the 50 series. If you remember, we covered it. NVIDIA launched its drivers, then it launched a hotfix to fix the drivers, and then it had to launch a hotfix to unfuck the hotfix that was supposed to fix the thing that it didn't fix but was still there, and then they had multiple other hotfixes layered on top of hotfixes, and we end up in the driver situation we're in today. Now, our favorite was when they had the hotfix to fix the hotfix, and they had to pull it back. But there's good news. NVIDIA is using AI to fuck up their drivers 3 times faster. Corsair, a company that presumably does stuff other than pump money in a circle among AI companies, posted that NVIDIA, quote, commits 3 times more code across 30,000 developers with Corsair, end quote. The company cited NVIDIA engineering as saying, quote, it's very hard for developers to stay on top of these changes and understand the entirety of the code base, end quote. So instead of learning the code base and doing what previously would have been known as their jobs, NVIDIA has a solution.
One of my favorite things is just vibe coding. Anybody could be a software programmer now. And vibe coding is creating software that...
Is this on the internet? What is this?
The Corsair quote of NVIDIA continues with, quote, after adopting Corsair is when we really started seeing significant increases in development velocity. We're using Corsair every day, and now there's no going back because it has completely changed the way software engineering works. Now again, we'd be open to this being a good thing if their drivers were immaculate. NVIDIA was known for its drivers, especially at a time when AMD couldn't get them right and Intel was still finding its footing. So if they had the best GPU drivers in the world still, if they were still reliable and stable and didn't have the giant scorch mark on their record that they do from last year, we'd be more open to this being a positive. But when the quote is, it changes how software development works, and the change in reality goes from works to not works, forgive us for being a little skeptical. Corsair states that, quote, developers using Corsair commit 3 times more code than before, end quote, while claiming that bug rates remain flat, which still means more bugs by volume, given more code volume. This comes after AMD got called out by the FFmpeg team for submitting what FFmpeg called AI slop. Anyway, it's strange. It really explains a lot, but also this comes at a time when AMD has been recovering its own image for its drivers, in that it's gone from having the worst drivers on the planet for maybe anything, say, I don't know, 8 or 9 years ago especially, to actually being pretty stable right now for its GPU drivers and overall good, which is still a weird thing to say considering half a decade of some of the worst drivers we'd ever covered. Up next, the US has removed YMTC from its entity list. In a round of deja vu, YMTC was added to the entity list. The entity list effectively bans companies from doing any business at all with companies that do business in the US if they want to continue doing business in the US. So everyone just stops working with them if they're on the entity list. The US government added YMTC to the entity list right when it was making some major technological advancements in the SSD space with its flash memory solutions, to the extent that Apple was considering using them. So the news is that the government removed YMTC from the entity list. The newer news is that 1 hour later, it removed the removal of them from the entity list. Doesn't mean they put them back on. We're not really sure. That's part of the fun with the United States government. It's a surprise box of mechanics, like a loot box. You open it and you don't know what you're going to get, but you're probably going to have to spend money, whatever it is. But in this case, especially if you want to get something and you're a company, especially a mega corporation, and the money is going to a politician. Anyway, the point is, YMTC is both on and not on the entity list right now, and so we're back to Schrodinger's entity list. Our documentary on the rise of Chinese memory has been getting a lot of spread lately. Really appreciate it, by the way. A lot of you have been linking it on Reddit and in forums and things like that. I've seen it, I appreciate it, and it arrived just in time for a bunch of people to start looking at CXMT memory, do testing on it, and apparently for the US government to decide to unban YMTC. Even better timing. If you missed the documentary, you should check it out. It was entirely funded by you all, our viewers, and it deep dives into the Chinese memory industry for an hour, which coincidentally, if you had started watching it when the US removed YMTC from the entity list, you would not be done watching it when the US decided to retract the removal of YMTC from the entity list. Anyway, as part of the documentary, we talked about how the US government's Bureau of Industry and Security placed YMTC on that list. The quick recap is that YMTC is China's rising star flash NAND producer, and it's currently looking at getting into DRAM in a more serious capacity. YMTC developed highly competitive technologies and SSDs with incredible density, to the extent that Apple had considered using YMTC. As soon as that news broke, the US government then banned YMTC from the market by placing it on that list, alleging national security concerns. That somehow only arose when a company was considering using them instead of incumbent suppliers. But anyway, it's a free market where competition is good, right up until the point that that competition might benefit the consumer, the actual individual at the end of the pipeline, instead of some gigantic fucking corporation. Reuters writes, quote, "The United States withdrew an updated list of Chinese firms allegedly aiding Beijing's military shortly after it was posted on Friday. The document, which was posted for about an hour, also had removed China's top memory chip makers, CXMT and YMTC, from the list, drawing fire from China hawks in Washington who fear the growing chip-making expertise of these companies could help supercharge China's military," end quote. The Pentagon followed up with a letter to the Federal Register of the U.S. government imploring the removal of the entity list update. Reuters notes that former White House National Security Council staffer Biden stated, quote, "Hopefully the Pentagon pulled the document because removing CXMT and YMTC was an error," end quote. For now, as far as we're aware at the time of writing this story, they are still sort of removed from the entity list. I don't fucking know. I did call, we've worked with law firms in the past where we asked them to help with stories, basically give us background information. I called one that I've spoken to before that specializes in, I guess you'd call it export control specifically in Washington, D.C., and they were basically like, I mean, they used more professional language, but they were basically like, yeah, we don't fucking know. This normally doesn't happen. So that was kind of, I was looking for a quote to give you all. I didn't really get one. They said basically what I thought, which is that there's not a lot of precedent for this. My understanding from what they were saying is that it's like kind of paused, where if you're a company like Apple, and if you had consideration of using YMTC again, then you would put those thoughts on pause right now until you see what happens next because of the Pentagon letter to the Federal Register and whatever. So anyway, the companies were previously banned for alleged ties to the Chinese military. However, as we've pointed out in the past, I mean, you can play that game both ways. NVIDIA, AMD, and Micron all also supply the US military, if only just by literally the CPUs, GPUs, and memory that go in their computers and their servers and their data centers. And likewise, Intel is 10% owned by the US federal government. So we can all play this game if that's the game we want to play. The only American export larger, though, than our current hypocrisy is AI. And the AI industry must go on, and in order for that march to continue while also supplying the consumer market, such as Apple with its upcoming next iPhone launch that's ever on the horizon, the unban of CXMT and YMTC would help with that. It would help enable the onward march of the AI industry, if only to supply the lesser devices that consumers buy in the eyes of hyperscalers. The most obvious question is what happens with SMIC, China's banned silicon fabrication company. SMIC is China's best bet at getting higher-end CPU and GPU fabrication online. As for Apple, IGWay posted an update. This publication was one of our regular sources for our documentary, and via machine translation, the publication writes that Apple was, quote, forced to agree to a doubling of purchase prices from Kioxia with quarterly price increases, end quote. IGWay also recites Apple's previous consideration of using YMTC and CXMT. And otherwise, that's it for this one. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more. Go to store.gamersaccess.net to support us directly, like by grabbing one of our copyright takedown t-shirts. That's right. It's got, I mean, you can't read it because it's redacted. There's an interpretation of a company name on the shirt, but it's just an artistic interpretation. Actually, the text isn't even complete. There's a line through the middle of it, and so we don't really know what it says. I don't know. My artist on the team did it, Andrew, and I didn't ask him what it says. It's purely, you can take your best guess. I think it's an abstract set of shapes that almost look like they could be words that spell a company. So check that out on store.gamersaccess.net. Thanks for watching. See you all next time.